Well, hi everybody, it's Dr. Parker. I am going to talk about the general prologue to the Canterbury Tales. We've already had an introduction to the tales as a whole, but today I want to deal with the general prologue, and it's a pretty important document even on its own. I mean, I realize that it introduces the tales, but as a text by itself, it has a lot to say. It has a lot going on. I'm going to try to move quickly, and I'm not going to cover every single one of the characters that are described in the prologue, but I do want to talk about some of the notable ones and why I think that they're important here. Um, I've found this, and I've seen this before, but I found this is a really nice engraving of all of the pilgrims. And if you look it up online, you can zoom in. And this is by William Blake, the poet, who a lot of you probably know also was really into engraving and woodcuts and all kinds of things like this. And he was a big fan of Chaucer's, and he was one of the first people to sort of posit the idea that Chaucer was trying to provide a sketch of different types of personalities. He was the first one to kind of articulate that. I guess other people had probably thought it before. But anyways, this is sort of a nice, very much kind of an 18th, 19th century vision of what Chaucer's characters look like, although we talked about the Ellesmere manuscript last time, and I'm going to show you some portraits from there so you can see what Chaucer's, or right after Chaucer's time, people would have interpreted them as. But I want to talk about genre, what kind of a work this is, the general prologue, and most people put it in the category of what we call estates satire. And the estates, in the medieval mind, the estates among men were those who pray, which is to say the clergy, those who fight, which would be the nobility, the knights, but also they're also the aristocrats, and then those who work, and those are like the plowmen and people like that. So you can see in this nice little decorated initial, we've got a clergyman and a knight, and then talking together, and then a fellow with a shovel who's probably wisely keeping his mouth shut while those two speak. So those were seen to be the estates of man, and then women were held to a slightly different standard, and it was less occupational, but it was more sexually determined. Virgin, widow, and wife, and those were very much held as the three, as a rank in order. Best to be a virgin, if not, better to be a widow, and then if not that, a wife, and of course any other anything outside of those three was beneath recognition. But it's interesting that men's stations tended to be governed by birth and occupation, and women's were governed more by their sexuality. So, estate satire is a kind of work that discusses the different estates of men and women, but mostly men. And it's a satire, and a satire is, of course, often funny, but a satire is also something that's designed to inspire reform or change. A satirical cartoon in a newspaper is not only supposed to be funny, but it's also supposed to show a fault that needs to be corrected. And so Chaucer, especially when it comes to the church, was really lampooning the church pretty severely, presumably in an attempt to get them to change, to upgrade, to see some of their own faults. So the estates of man, those who pray, those who fight, and those who work, it was all well and good through the Middle Ages. But what you're starting to have in Chaucer's time, and something that was important because Chaucer himself was the child of a venture capitalist, was that there was starting to be some lack of clarity about where everybody belonged. Um, because you've got the beginning of kind of a capitalist economy. We're moving away from the feudal system, away from people being sort of tied to the land, and we're moving more towards a capitalist trade system. And what you're having is people in England who are not born to the nobility. They don't have a family title, they don't have lands, but they, through dint of trade, usually by trading wool, which there was a lot of in England, with people on the continent for, say, wine, and then bringing it back to England and selling it at a profit, we're bringing in this sort of new economic system, and it becomes very unclear and a little bit disquieting to people. Where do these merchants belong? Where do these people in the merchant class, as it was called, especially in London, where do they fit in? Because you could certainly be someone who was born to no land and no title and end up having more money than someone who was part of the landed gentry, someone who did have a title. The whole movement in wealth from being tied up in land to being tied up in gold or cash or inventory was a new one, and people, it seemed to sort of violate the natural order of things. How could you be a wealthy person if you weren't an earl or a duke and you didn't have thousands of acres to your name? But they were very much the up and coming class in London and many parts of Europe in the 1300s. This is a nice painting by Holbein. I think it's Holbein the Younger, of a merchant in on the continent. But this is much what an English merchant would have been like. And these were people that appear in the Canterbury Tales. So we've got certainly we have the traditional three estates represented in the general prologue. We have the knight as one who fought. We have lots of people who are in the clergy. And then we've got the plowman is probably the one person on the Tales pilgrimage who represents those who work. But then you've got all these other people in the middle, and some of them are craftsmen and tradesmen, but they seem to be well off. Some of them, they have nice clothes, they have nice things. And this is new. This is something that Chaucer's world was just coming into. So I think this sort of level of discomfort with the new class was something Chaucer was interested in, and certainly his peers and betters would have been interested in. But I'm going to talk about some of the pilgrims in particular now. And the first one who's mentioned is the knight, and he is in fact the only person on the pilgrimage who has a rank, is Sir Somebody. We don't know Sir what, but he is Sir Somebody. And with him is his son, the squire, who is essentially an apprentice knight, and their servant, the yeoman. And the yeoman is someone who would travel with them, go to make camp and things like that. The knight is, most people think that Chaucer is presenting him as kind of an ideal. He is, we have a list of all the places where he's been to war, and it's a considerable list, and he always performed well. What Chaucer's audience would have picked up on is that many of these places were crusades. So they weren't just political wars, they were in some cases holy wars. And it's interesting because as 21st century people, we're pretty horrified by the notion of the Crusades, and we're pretty, those of us who are Christian are pretty unhappy that that's connected to our legacy. On the other hand, Chaucer's audience, I think, would have been pretty much 100% on board with him. They would have been proud of him for going and fighting those infidels, and no doubt killing many of them. There's a dissenting voice on this, Terry Jones, who you may know because he used to be in Monty Python, is also a PhD holding medievalist, and he's written a book on Chaucer's Knight where he thinks that Chaucer's actually criticizing the knight, that he is criticizing his mercenary tendencies. I don't know anybody who agrees with that thesis, though, and I don't agree with it. Because the other things we find out about the knight is that even though he is presumably got a little bit of wealth, he has very plain clothes on. In fact, he has still got rust on his shirt from where he was wearing his chainmail. So he's come very recently from his last battle, it says, in order to go on this pilgrimage to do religious service. So I think that we're supposed to see him as being very pious. The other thing we see about him is he's very, very humble. He never says anything. This is no matter of villainy did he ever say to anyone, even people of the lower classes. And the knight's the one person on the pilgrimage who probably could get away with that, who probably could call someone out or insult somebody by dint of his, first of all, of his physical intimidation level, and also because of his rank. But he never does. He's always a peacemaker. We see throughout the tales he's always trying to bring people together to stop discord and strife. So the knight is held up as being an ideal of Chaucer's. Usually we talk about the knight, the clerk, the plowman, and the parson as being Chaucer's favorites, who are held up as being more or less uncriticized. by Chaucer. Now, with the knight, we have his son, the squire, and the squire is an interesting guy. He is young, he's about 20. He has beautiful, curly, long blonde hair. He has very, very fancy clothes, which Chaucer's audience would have seen he spent a lot of money on, were fairly expensive. He loves ladies. He loves being out late every night courting ladies, is probably the polite way to put it. I presume it's not the same lady every night. He knows all the things that a lover is supposed to know. He knows how to sing. He knows how to write poetry. He knows how to dance. So these are all things that are associated with a lover. So our first impression of the squire is that he might be, first of all, he might be a little bit effeminate, but barring that, and I don't think they would have seen him as effeminate. They would have seen him as a lover, as a ladies' man, and we might question, are his priorities in the right place? He's not maybe just like his father who is very pious and very humble with his clothing and with his demeanor. But right at the end of the description of the squire, one of the things it says is that he was I don't have my book in front of me, but he was lowly and humble and serviceable, and he carved before his father at the table. And what that means literally is that when they went somewhere to eat, the squire would stand up and carve the roast or whatever beast they were eating and serve his father first as a sign of respect. So I think one of the things that Chaucer's really, really good at is gentle satire. So even I do think we're supposed to look at this guy and say, okay, he spends too much money on clothes. He's got too many girlfriends. He's probably a little bit much to take sometimes with his hair and his singing and all that. But on the other hand, I think we're supposed to see that his fundamentals are good, that he's basically, because we also get a list of battles that he's been in, and he's done well at jousts and on the battlefield. So, and who's to say maybe his father was exactly like this when he was 20 years old. And then he settled down and became serious. So I think that even though Chaucer, I think, is poking a little bit of fun at the squire, I think mostly it's kind of an affectionate and gentle poking. And I think more we're supposed to see that the squire, when he sort of grows into his upbringing, will be maybe more like his father than he is now. And then the yeoman, I don't want to really talk about the yeoman except to say that he's a consummate professional. He wears Lincoln green. He's sort of like Robin Hood. He's a forester. He's like some of the good old boys who live around me, who he would drive an F-150 and have a camo cap and be really, really good at what he does. And so I think that's most of what we get from him. But that's the first party in the pilgrimage, are these three. And he does come first. I mean, I don't think that Chaucer's trying too strictly to play rank here, but the knight is the person who logically would come first because, as I say, he's the one that's got a title. All right, so after the knight, and I promise you I'm not going to go through everybody in this level of detail, but we have a really interesting character, and this is the prioress, and the prioress has got a nun traveling with her. And then either a priest with her or maybe three priests with her. And the reason that I say this is because it says that there was the prioress and her fellow nun. And then it says Prestes tre, Preest, which is priest, es, which by the manuscript you can't tell if the es is part of priest or it's a separate word, is, and then thre, Thre. So prest as thre either means there's the prioress, the second nun, and the priest makes three, or it's the prioress, the other nun, and three priests three. So we don't really know. One of the reasons that we can't tell you exactly how many people are on the pilgrimage is because of this. We don't know if it's one priest or three priests. But the prioress, a priory is a small monastic house for women. She's the head of it. It's not as big as an abbey. It's probably 12 to 15 women, and the prioress is her name's Madame Eglantine. We know that she is very interested in manners. She's very interested in the way her table is set. She's very interested in courtesy and things like that, all of which are good values, but they're not they're not necessarily Mother Teresa level values. They're not necessarily the most pious of values. But they're more courtly values, I would say, than they are churchly, if that's a word, values. Then when we see that she's got small dogs, little yappy purse dogs, that she feeds with meat from the table. And when we get a look at her, we see that she has beautiful gray eyes, which that was very much the courtly love ideal, was for a woman to have not only blue eyes but actually gray eyes. She has gray eyes. She has a full red mouth. She's very soft, it says, and a turned up little nose. And so it sounds like she has a beautiful face, a princess style face. But then it says she was not undergrown. She was not small. She was not a little woman, and so she's kind of a big girl. So what we take away from this, Chaucer is interested in the idea of physiognomy, which is to say that people look like what they are. So if you have some, and not necessarily in real, I don't think he necessarily believed this of people in real life, but in his books, his characters look like what they are. So what does that mean about the prioress? Okay, well the prioress is just a beautiful face, a princess-like courtly love, aristocratic face, and then kind of an ungainly form, just kind of a larger. And I don't think that she's supposed to look awful or terrible, but she's not small. So you to think about her, I think it helps to think about what women's options were in the Middle Ages. So we know that she went to school at a place called Stratford at Bow, which was a very kind of expensive boarding school. So she is a rich girl. If you were a family and you had daughters, you had more than one daughter, regardless of this is sort of outside of whether or not you had sons, but if you had daughters, the normal way of doing things was to put all of your dowry money behind the eldest daughter, with the philosophy being it would be better to have your eldest daughter make a great marriage than all of your several daughters to make mediocre marriages. It was the way of thinking was much the same as the way that they thought about the sons, which is to say that you would leave an entire estate to the eldest son and not divide it up, because wealth was mostly held in the form of land. So when you divide land, it becomes worth a lot less. And once you do that over several generations, you might start with 1,000 acres and end up with a bunch of grandchildren or great grandchildren that have these little 10-acre or 50-acre farms, which don't end up being that productive and don't constitute a lot of wealth. So the idea was, and that idea sort of transferred over to the daughters. Let's put everything behind the oldest daughter, and then everyone else can sort of fend for themselves. So with the men, a lot of times, if you were a second son or third son or whatever, you could enter the military, which was a fairly because if you were a gentleman, even if you didn't have a lot of money, if you were an aristocrat, you would become an officer, and you would become a knight and things like that, and that was okay. If you are, or you can enter the church, you can become a priest, maybe even have your eye on being a bishop someday, and that was a pretty attractive option, as we'll see when we look at some of the other characters. But for women, all right. So if you're a second or a third or a fourth daughter, and this is the same as it ever was. If you were especially pretty, you probably would still get married even without a large dowry behind you. If you were especially delightful or charming or all of those things. But yeah, I mean, I'm sorry to say, but of course it was the pretty ones who often would get married. What if you're a second daughter and you're not beautiful and you're not enticing and charming and you're not a good flirt or whatever? You really don't have much left because you can't live on your own. They don't really accept single unmarried women in the society. And widows were a different matter. Widows often did live by themselves and in great comfort, as we'll see with the wife of Bath. So you would continue to live with your father, and when he died, you would go to live with a brother or an uncle or whatever male relative was surviving. And so you more or less you either belonged to your husband, who, and you know, you might not like your husband. It's probably an arranged marriage. It might be someone a good deal older that you were fixed to for political reasons or financial reasons. And or you can stay living at home the rest of your life. And those are kind of your two options, except that you could also become a nun. And you know, if we polled all of you all in this class and asked how many of you wish to become nuns, I suspect the answer might be zero. But back then in the Middle Ages, I mean, you're like I said, you could be married to someone who you might not like at all, or if you were lucky, if you're really lucky, you had a good marriage. Or you could live in your father's house until he died, and then live in your brother's house. Or you could be a nun, and if you're a nun, you receive some education, you receive some amount of prestige and authority in the society. People respected you. You are physically safe because you're living in a place that's walled and locked up, which is no small thing for a woman in the Middle Ages to have some degree of physical safety. It's not really such a bad option. Is not as bad as it might seem at first glance. So here I think we have the prioress. I think the prioress, we know she's from a wealthy family because she went to this fancy school. We also know that she is not a tiny person. She's not a size 2. And I think that she's not the first daughter, because I think if she were the eldest daughter, she would have a big dowry and would make some sort of a marriage. So here she is, and she's not really an Olympic level nun. I mean, she's interested in courtly manners. It even says she wants to keep the appearance of court at her table. She keeps dogs, which nuns are not supposed to do, and she feeds them meat from her table, which is meat that could go to the many homeless, starving people in the streets. So she seems to kind of be someone who wanted to be a princess, and she has the face of a princess, um, but who has to live in a way that's probably not her first choice. And so she has the face of a princess and the body of someone who's not a princess. And so this is where she's ended up. And we see her as maybe trying to live out the life that she didn't have. So she can be seen as kind of a sad figure, I think, and but one that is pretty compelling, because I think Chaucer is really understanding the dynamics of what it might be like to be a woman in her situation in the Middle Ages. And then we don't really hear about the people with her, the other nun or the priest. So I'm going to move ahead. We've got this little chain of monastic figures. So now we've got the monk and the friar, and that is not a medieval illustration, but I kind of liked it. So here we have two more monastics. Now, first you get the monk. The difference between the monk and a friar: a monk is supposed to live at a monastery. A monk is connected to a foundation, to a building, really. Friars, on the other, and a monk lives off of money that the monastery makes. Monasteries had lots and lots of lands that they kind of sharecropped and made money off of, and so some monasteries were really wealthy. So the monks are fed and clothed and whatever off the proceeds of that. Friars are like monks in that they take vows of stability and celibacy and poverty, but they're also mendicants, which means that they are meant to beg for their sustenance. They go out in the streets and they beg. This friar is a limiter, is what it says, which means that he has this sort of limited district within which he can beg. So the monk and the friar, but like I said, they've both taken vows of obedience, chastity, poverty, meaning not necessarily meaning that the monastery doesn't have any money, but they don't have any goods that are personal to them. The monk especially, that he doesn't own things, but everything he has been given to the monastery. What did I say? So obedience, chastity, poverty, and stability for the monk, which means that you're supposed to stay cloistered. You're supposed to stay in the walls of the monastery. Okay, so we had the prioress, and the prioress was not awful, but she was not the very best of all possible prioresses. Now we have the monk, and we get a little bit worse with the monk. So the monk, we know. we know that the monk is I'm sorry, I just had to answer a question from a child. Uh, we know the monk is allowed to be outside the monastery because he's what's called an outrider. So this is actually okay that he's, well, it's kind of okay. Outriders were monks who could leave the monastery to conduct business because, like I say, they have all these lands and farms and things, and they have to go and conduct business and buy supplies and things like that. So he's an outrider, so he's allowed to be outside the building, but this trip is not necessarily a business trip. This is, it seems to be more of kind of a social, fun trip for him. But anyway, but he's out. So if he were meant to keep a vow of stability, he's broken that. Um, Poverty, he's not really having any of that. He has got he talks about that he's got lots of horses in his stables, that he's got lots of greyhounds that he keeps for hunting. And if you know anything about those things, they're terribly expensive. It's really expensive to keep a horse, much less a whole bunch of them, and dogs. We also find out that his monk's robe is lined with ermine, with fur, and it's very sort of finely trimmed. And the point of a habit, which is a monk's robe, is to make you look like everyone else, is to make everybody in the monastery equal so that no one person can show off their status through their clothes. It's almost the same idea as school uniforms, the idea that to take the mind off of clothes and appearance. But of course, if you pimp out your habit by putting a bunch of fur and stuff on it, you've sort of defeated that purpose. So his vows of and then he talks about the rules. He says, I don't really believe in all these rules they have for us. I don't want to work all day. I don't want to study all day. These rules are kind of old fashioned, so I don't really hold much by them. So far his vows of stability and poverty and obedience seem to be in some peril, or to be flouted outright. And finally, we see that he has got, it says his hood is fastened with a pin, which is called a love knot. And a love knot was kind of a gold wire work piece of jewelry, and it was pretty much a symbol of love. This is something you gave to your girlfriend or your boyfriend, your romantic love interest. And the knot symbolized the fact that you were tied together. And he wears this very proudly where it's prominent and everybody can see it. So, um, monks are not so much supposed to have girlfriends. But apparently he's got one, and not only does he have one, but he's pretty blatant about it. So I'm guessing his vow of celibacy is not so great either. And then we come to the friar. Now the friar is, like I said, he has to make his living from begging. So what he does is he takes confessions. He's a confessor, which means that you can go to him and say, "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." And he asks for your confession, and he has you have a penance, which is something you have to do, prayers you have to say, or work you have to do, and then he can give you absolution. So if you are a good Catholic Christian in the Middle Ages in England, you have a choice. You can go to your good old parish priest, your Father Callahan, who has known you since he baptized you and you were a tiny infant. And you can confess to him. Now, if you confess to him, he's known you. I mean, imagine someone that you've known since you were a little child and you've done something that's kind of bad. You don't want him to know that anyway. And you also know he's a pretty tough grader, so he's going to give you a